What if the greatest secret of Eden was never the forbidden fruit, but what was protected after it? Few people realize this detail, but the Bible says that the tree of life was guarded by angels, not destroyed. And that changes everything, because nobody protects something worthless, and nobody guards something that cannot, one day, be accessed. What if those angels weren't there to hinder humanity, but to guide it at the right moment? What exactly was hidden in that tree? And why does this knowledge still seem to awaken something within you today? What if the tree of life was never just a physical tree lost at some mythical point in the past, but something much closer, more intimate, something that has always been within you? Have you ever stopped to think about why so many ancient traditions speak of the tree of life not as an object, but as a principle, a state, a consciousness? Perhaps the most uncomfortable question is another. What if the greatest mistake was not humanity being expelled from Eden, but forgetting what Eden truly represented? From an early age, many people learn this story in a simple, almost childlike way. A tree, a perfect garden, access denied, as if everything had been taken away forever. But when we look more closely, something doesn't fit. The ancient text doesn't say that the tree of life was destroyed. It says that it was preserved. And this completely changes the mindset with which we view this narrative. Because nobody preserves what has no value. And nobody protects something that doesn't have a greater purpose. What you are about to discover may surprise you, because this reading does not follow the traditional religious path. Here, the tree of life ceases to be an external symbol and becomes understood as an internal state, a level of consciousness, a living truth that can only be accessed by those who cross certain limits of their own perception. Have you ever experienced moments when you felt there was something deeper within you, but didn't know exactly how to reach it? Perhaps that is precisely what this story has always been about. In many ancient mystical, Gnostic, and philosophical traditions, the tree of life was never treated as literal wood, leaves, and fruit. It was understood as the totality of being, the direct connection between the human and the divine, between the limited and the eternal. Not something found with the feet, but with consciousness. Not something harvested with the hands, but with choices, inner transformation, and spiritual awakening. And perhaps that is why access to it has never been simple. Notice how this idea directly relates to our own journey. From the moment we begin to question, to seek meaning, to feel discomfort with ready-made answers, something within us begins to stir. It's as if there's a silent calling, a distant memory of something once known. Stay with me until the end of this reflection, because understanding the tree of life in this way changes not only the story of Eden, but also how you perceive your own existence. This approach also reveals little discussed aspects of biblical tradition. Instead of a God who removes something as punishment, the idea of a process emerges. Certain levels of knowledge require maturity, responsibility, and awareness. The tree of life would not be out of reach due to punishment, but due to preparation. The impact of this reading is profound because it shifts the focus from guilt to the journey. It's not about deserving or not deserving, but about being ready to sustain what you access. And when you begin to see things this way, everything changes. Spirituality ceases to be blind obedience and becomes inner transformation. Faith ceases to be fear and becomes discernment. Myth ceases to be an ancient story and becomes a mirror of the human condition. The Garden of Eden, then, would not be a place lost in time, but a state of consciousness that moves away from or closer to us according to our decisions, our mindset, and our ability to see beyond the surface. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when we look at who guarded this tree, at the angels and their symbols, new layers of this hidden truth begin to reveal themselves. When we begin to look at these narratives with more sensitivity, we realize that they don't just speak of a distant past, but of something that continues to happen now, within each person who allows themselves to question. Perhaps that's why this topic evokes so much emotion. It's not just intellectual curiosity, it's identification. At some level, everyone has felt this silent calling, this feeling that there is something greater trying to be remembered. And if what we're discussing here has touched you in any way, it's very worthwhile to hear your voice too. If this subject makes sense to you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far, what has awakened a memory, doubt, or insight. Sometimes, a single shared phrase opens incredible paths for other people who are on the same journey. And if you felt that this reflection brought clarity, depth, or even a certain comfort, liking this video is a simple way to show it. It's not just an automatic click. It's a sign that this type of content matters, that it's worthwhile to continue exploring themes that go beyond the surface. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who are also seeking meaning, truth, and a more conscious spirituality. Subscribing to the channel in this context isn't just about watching new videos. It's about saying, "This resonates with me." It's about walking together, receiving these reflections whenever new content emerges, and helping to keep this space alive, where profound questions aren't avoided but welcomed. All of this creates a kind of silent community, connected by the desire to better understand one's own existence and the symbols that permeate human history. And while this exchange happens, while each comment, each like, and each new person who arrives strengthens this message, we can continue moving forward. Because understanding what the tree of life truly represents is only the beginning. There is something even deeper hidden in the figure of those who guarded it. And that's where this story begins to take on even more revealing contours. When we begin to look at the tree of life from this new angle, something silently changes within the mind. It ceases to be a distant element of an ancient myth and begins to function as a mirror, a living symbol. The idea that this supreme knowledge lies outside of humankind has always been comfortable because it shifts responsibility. But the oldest traditions, those that have walked behind the scenes of official history, suggest exactly the opposite. The tree of life was never lost in a physical garden. It has always been planted within human consciousness. And perhaps that is why so many cultures speak of it in different ways, but pointing in the same direction. When we speak of spiritual immortality, we are not referring to a body that never dies, but to a consciousness that awakens to something that can no longer be forgotten. The tree of life represents this state of unity with the source, where separation is no longer the primary focus. It is as if it symbolizes the point at which the human being ceases to perceive themselves as isolated and begins to understand the whole of which they are a part. This understanding does not arise as external information, but as an internal transformation, a profound change in mentality, in the way of feeling, deciding, and existing. In many mystical traditions, true knowledge is not something learned merely through words, but something remembered. Gnosticism speaks of this very clearly. To know is to awaken. It is not about accumulating data, but about accessing a hidden truth that has always been there, awaiting sufficient maturity to be integrated. The tree of life, in this sense, is the map of this awakening. Each branch, each symbolic fruit, represents levels of consciousness, states of perception, and choices that shape the inner journey. When Kabbalah describes the Sephirotic tree, it is not drawing a rigid religious scheme, but a flow of emanations from reality itself. It is a path between the invisible and the visible, between the absolute and the human. Even without going into technical terms, one can feel the weight of this idea. Life is not something separate from the divine, it is an extension of it. The tree of life, then, becomes the ultimate symbol of this connection, showing that the spark of the source is not distant, but pulsates within each being. This completely changes how we view Eden. If the tree of life is this supreme knowledge, then the garden was not just a place of comfort, but a specific state of consciousness. A starting point. The expulsion, so often mentioned in traditional texts, can be seen less as punishment and more as a necessary displacement for experience. After all, consciousness without experience does not mature. And experience without choices does not generate wisdom. This reading leads us to an uncomfortable, yet liberating truth. Awakening hurts. Transformation requires rupture. There is no unity without first experiencing the sensation of separation. The tree of life doesn't promise ease, it promises meaning. It doesn't offer protection against pain, but an understanding of why it exists. And this understanding profoundly alters the impact of the decisions we make along the journey. Perhaps that's why this symbol has been so carefully guarded in the human imagination. Not because anyone wanted to prevent access, but because this type of knowledge demands responsibility. Once you recognize your own connection to the source, there's no way to live the same way anymore. Choices gain weight, mindset changes, and the inner journey becomes inevitable. It's a one-way path, not because it's forbidden to return, but because expanded consciousness can no longer pretend not to see. In many ancient cultures, the tree of life appears associated with the idea of the center, the axis of the world, the point where heaven and earth meet. This is not just symbolic poetry. It's a way of saying that humankind occupies a unique place in creation, the point of connection between the visible and the invisible. The tree of life, then, is not a prize, but a spiritual responsibility. It invites unity, but demands emotional maturity and awareness of one's own shadows. And the more we contemplate this symbol, the clearer it becomes that it speaks not only of the past or the future, but of the present. Every conscious choice, every moment of presence, every sincere search for truth, is a way of approaching this state of unity. The tree of life is not reached through external rituals alone, but through a silent transformation that happens within, often far from the eyes of the world. At some point in this journey, an inevitable question arises. If the tree of life represents such profound and transformative knowledge, why did it need to be guarded? What exactly was at stake there? Who were those who watched over this symbol, and what was their true role in this story? It is when these questions begin to emerge that the narrative deepens even further, revealing layers that are rarely discussed openly. Before we move on with this reflection, it's worth noting something here. If this reading about the tree of life touched you in any way, write a simple word or phrase in the comments, something like "this makes sense to me," or "I'm on this journey too." Sometimes, acknowledging this aloud is the first step in realizing that this quest is not a solitary one. When the ancient text says that the tree of life came to be guarded after Eden, the image that almost everyone creates is that of a hostile blockade, a definitive expulsion, a punishment imposed by an authority that did not want humankind to advance. But when we slow down our reading and observe the symbolism behind this scene, something completely different begins to emerge. The presence of the angels and the flaming sword does not point to rejection, but rather to a conscious limit. A limit that does not arise from fear, but from the need for maturation. The fiery sword, so often mentioned, is rarely understood as a symbol of discernment. Fire, in virtually all ancient spiritual traditions, represents active awareness, purification, and transformation. It is not an element of gratuitous destruction, but of refinement. When something passes through fire, it is not eliminated, it is transmuted. The sword, in turn, symbolizes cutting, separating what is illusory from what is essential. Together, these two symbols form a powerful message. Access to supreme knowledge requires clarity, responsibility, and inner readiness. This completely changes the mindset about what happened after Eden. Humanity wasn't removed because it was unworthy, but because it was still under construction. The newly awakened consciousness needed to go through experience, time, error, the impact of decisions, and the weight of freedom before it could sustain the whole. The tree of life could not be accessed without the soul being prepared to deal with the consequences of that access. It's not about external control, but about internal protection. In many mystical traditions, there is the idea that certain knowledge is not given, it is attained. Not because someone is hiding something, but because the very structure of consciousness needs to be ready to receive it. Otherwise, what should liberate ends up fragmenting even further. This is a recurring principle in Gnosticism, Hermeticism, and various ancient philosophical currents. Truth does not impose itself, it reveals itself when it finds space. When texts speak of guardian angels, they may not be describing armed entities blocking passage, but rather states of consciousness that function as natural filters. The flaming sword can be seen as the very limit of the unprepared mind. While the mentality is trapped in fear, control, and the pursuit of external power, this portal remains inaccessible. Not as punishment, but due to spiritual coherence. Total knowledge cannot be sustained by a fragmented consciousness. This interval in the human journey, this symbolic separation, then begins to make sense. Human beings needed to walk through the experience of duality, to experience light and shadow, to build identity, to develop empathy, to fail, to learn, and to refine their decisions. Without this process, the tree of life would be merely an empty concept. Spiritual immortality is not born from the denial of pain, but from its understanding. And understanding only comes with experience. There is also a detail that is almost always ignored. The text doesn't say that the path was destroyed, only preserved. To preserve is not to erase. To preserve is to keep until the right moment. This suggests that access was never canceled, only postponed. A postponement that respects the rhythm of human consciousness. The journey was not interrupted, it was extended. And perhaps it is precisely in this prolongation that wisdom is formed. This reading has a profound impact on how we perceive our own internal blocks today. How many times do we feel that something is out of reach, not because it has been denied to us, but because we are still maturing towards it? How many doors seem closed when in reality they are just waiting for a change of mindset, a silent transformation, a different choice? The narrative of the guarded tree resonates directly with modern experiences of spiritual seeking and self-knowledge. Instead of seeing angels as jailers, it begins to make sense to see them as hidden guides. Not guides who lead by the hand, but who establish loving boundaries. Boundaries that prevent premature advancement and protect the essence of the process. True protection lies not in hindering the journey, but in ensuring that it does not destroy those who are not yet ready to embark on it. And the more we reflect on this, the clearer it becomes that Eden hasn't been left behind in time. It has moved inward. The guardianship of the tree of life takes place today, within human consciousness itself. Every limiting belief, every unconfronted fear, every decision made without presence functions as this symbolic sword. Not to punish, but to signal that there is still inner work to be done. There is something profoundly liberating in this perspective. It removes the narrative from guilt and repositions it in responsibility. We are not rejected by the sacred. We are invited to mature until we can sustain what we seek. The hidden truth does not conceal itself out of malice, but out of respect for the soul's process. And perhaps this is one of the greatest revelations of this symbol. The divine trusts in the timing of human consciousness. When this understanding takes hold, the question ceases to be why were we prevented, and becomes what still needs to be integrated within us. It is at this point that the journey changes direction. It is no longer about recovering something lost, but about becoming someone capable of accessing it. And this internal shift opens up space to understand who these guardians truly were and what role they continue to play in the human journey to this day. If this reading about the Tree of Life has sparked something in you, leave a simple comment like, "This makes sense to me," or "I'm on this journey too." Sometimes, naming this recognition is the first sign that something has already begun to move inside. When we get to the point of looking at the angels guarding the Tree of Life, almost everything we've been taught so far begins to be reversed. The classic image of rigid, cold beings, armed to prevent humanity from progressing, doesn't hold up when we observe the symbolism more deeply. These angels don't appear as jailers of a lost paradise, but as guardians of a delicate balance. They don't protect a physical place, they protect a state of consciousness. And this change of perspective completely alters the impact of this narrative on our own journey. In ancient symbolic language, angels are not merely external entities with wings and swords. They represent organizing forces of reality, archetypes of higher consciousness that operate between chaos and order. When the text says they guarded the path to the Tree of Life, the key word is not tree, but path. Access does not depend on traversing a space, but on maintaining a specific mindset. What is being protected is not the entrance, but the process. This reveals a powerful hidden truth. Awakening doesn't happen abruptly. It needs to respect the inner rhythm of the awakener. If human consciousness had immediate access to the totality of knowledge, without passing through the layers of experience, decision, and responsibility, the result would not be liberation, but collapse. Angels, in this context, function as regulators. They maintain the balance between ignorance and consciousness, ensuring that expansion happens without destroying the structure that sustains it. Now I want to delve even deeper into this point, because there's a revelation here that's almost never explored. These guardians don't act against humanity. They act in favor of the human journey. The symbolic blockage isn't a no, it's a not yet. It's like a door that only opens when the person arriving no longer needs to force their way in. When consciousness matures, the door ceases to be perceived as an obstacle and begins to be recognized as a passage. This idea appears repeatedly in spiritual and philosophical traditions around the world. There are always guardians at the thresholds. There are always tests, symbols, enigmas, or apparent limits. Not because anyone wants to hide the truth, but because the truth requires internal structure. Without this structure, it becomes too heavy. The angels, then, do not block progress, they filter it. They ensure that only that which can be integrated reaches the surface of consciousness. When we look at it from this angle, we realize that these guardians continue to act to this day, only internally. They manifest as doubts, existential crises, deep discomfort, and moments of rupture. These are the periods when something within us knows it is ready to change, but still needs to reorganize beliefs, values, and decisions. It's not punishment, it's preparation. It's not rejection, it's refinement. There is a very strong psychological impact in this reading. It removes us from the role of victims of an unjust spiritual system and places us as active participants in a journey of transformation. If something has not yet been fully revealed, perhaps it is not because it is hidden, but because we are still learning to sustain what has already been revealed. This change in mindset alters the way we deal with frustrations, silences, and apparent blockages in life. Angels, as archetypes, represent elevated states of consciousness that have already integrated what humanity is still learning. They do not compete with us, they point the way. They function as silent references to what is possible to become. And that is why the narrative never speaks of the destruction of the tree of life. It remains intact, alive, awaiting not a physical return to Eden, but an inner advancement of human consciousness. When we understand that the path is protected, not denied, the search shifts focus. Instead of trying to force answers, we begin to develop presence. Instead of fighting against limits, we begin to listen to them. Each limit reveals something about what still needs to be integrated. Each symbolic guardian indicates a point in the journey that demands more maturity, more clarity, and more responsibility for one's own decisions. There's a subtle but extremely important detail. Angels don't explain the path, they only guard it. This means that no one can make this journey for us. The journey is individual, silent, and profoundly transformative. The guardian's role is not to teach, but to ensure that the process is not corrupted by haste or ego. Consciousness needs to arrive whole on the other side. And perhaps it is precisely here that the narrative begins to connect with something even deeper, because if angels guard the path, then the real question is not who they are, but what within us still needs to cross that threshold. What still weighs us down, what still binds us, what still fragments us. This reflection opens up space to understand that awakening is not an isolated event, but a sequence of gradual revelations that adjust to the rhythm of our own inner evolution. If all of this resonated with you on some level, write something simple in the comments like, "This made sense to me," or "I'm living through this transformation." Sometimes, acknowledging this in words is already part of the path itself, which begins to unfold, while other layers of this story continue to reveal themselves. When the image of the flaming sword appears in this narrative, many people still imagine something violent, threatening, almost like an instrument of divine punishment. But when we look more closely, this interpretation begins to dissolve. The sword is not there to wound bodies. It exists to cut through illusions. The fire that surrounds it does not destroy, it illuminates. And this is a profound shift in perception because it transforms a symbol of fear into a symbol of active consciousness. The flaming sword represents the discernment that arises when the mind and spirit cease to accept anything without question. It is the ability to separate what is true from what is inherited narrative, what is essence from what is conditioning. The fire is not there by chance. Fire has always been a symbol of purification, of transformation, of something that consumes what is false and reveals what is real. In this sense, the flaming sword is the exact point where truth meets responsibility. There is a hidden truth here that is rarely discussed. Accessing profound knowledge without inner preparation can be more destructive than liberating. The sword appears as a constant reminder that all revelation requires maturity. It does not block access out of cruelty, but protects the individual from themselves. Because not all truth can be borne by a mind that has not yet learned to bear the weight of its own decisions. Now I want to delve even deeper into this symbol, because it directly touches on how we deal with choices in real life. The flaming sword doesn't cut external paths. it cuts through internal layers. It emerges when someone approaches truths that demand a change of posture, a revision of values, and the abandonment of old identities. It's the moment when it's no longer possible to pretend not to know. Consciousness, once activated, doesn't allow a return to the same comfortable state of ignorance. This is the point where many spiritual journeys become confused. Some seek revelations, mystical experiences, and profound answers, but are unwilling to transform their own mindset. The flaming sword exists precisely at this threshold. It silently asks, what will you do with what you discover? Because every truth accessed without integration generates internal conflict. And every awakened consciousness without responsibility generates imbalance. The sword's fire symbolizes this impact. It illuminates, but it also burns away what cannot continue as it is. Old beliefs, repetitive patterns, decisions made automatically. None of this survives contact with conscious truth. That's why the symbol is uncomfortable. It marks the point of no return on the journey. From that point on, living on autopilot is no longer a real option. In many ancient traditions, fire is linked to initiation. Not as a spectacle, but as an internal process. The flaming sword is an ongoing initiation. It appears whenever a person is about to access a deeper layer of themselves. Not as a threat, but as a warning. A warning that what comes next requires coherence between thought, emotion, and action. It demands alignment. There is also a very strong psychological aspect to this symbol. The sword represents the sharp mind, trained to observe its own shadow. And the fire represents the courage to overcome inner discomfort. Together, they form the awakened consciousness. The one that doesn't shy away from difficult questions. The one that faces truths that dismantle personal narratives, but build something more solid in their place. Throughout history, whenever humankind has attempted to access power, knowledge, or influence without this internal filter, the result has been distortion. The flaming sword emerges as a symbolic mechanism of balance. It ensures that access to the tree of life, understood as full consciousness, is not driven by empty curiosity or an inflated ego, but by genuine maturity. What is at stake is not information, but transformation. And perhaps this is the most overlooked point in this narrative. The sword is not wielded against the human being, it is held before him. It reflects back what the person already carries within. If there is confusion, it cuts. If there is illusion, it burns. If there is clarity, it opens a path. The symbol does not change, it is those who approach it who change. This leads us to a deeper understanding of the spiritual journey as a whole. It's not about accumulating answers, but about becoming someone capable of living according to them. The flaming sword is a constant reminder that awareness without action generates conflict, and action without awareness generates chaos. The balance between the two is the true gateway. As this symbol begins to make sense, something rearranges itself internally. The search ceases to be for shortcuts and becomes one of integration. Curiosity transforms into responsibility. And the journey ceases to be merely about discovering something new, becoming about sustaining a new way of being in the world. This silent movement is what prepares the ground for even deeper layers of this story, where the focus is no longer just on external symbols, but on what they activate within each of us. If this interpretation resonated with you, write a simple word like discernment or clarity in the comments, just to mark this moment in your journey as we move forward, because there are still important revelations connecting just ahead. When we begin to understand that the tree of life was never uprooted from the world, something silently changes within us. The idea of loss gives way to the perception of displacement. Access was not denied, it was internalized. What was previously projected as a fixed point in Eden becomes understood as a state of consciousness, an inner alignment that cannot be inherited, imposed, or granted by external authority. This understanding completely alters the logic of the spiritual journey because it shifts the focus from dogma to lived experience. The path back to one's celestial origin is not a geographical route, nor a specific ritual, much less a belief repeated mechanically. It happens in the realm of daily decisions, of a gradually transforming mindset, of the courage to confront what has been repressed and integrate what has always been avoided. Returning does not mean going back in time, but remembering who one was before the layers of conditioning. It is a process of deep, almost intimate recollection, which does not happen from the outside in, but from the inside out. There is a hidden truth here that resonates strongly with our time. Never before has so much spiritual information been available, and at the same time, never before has there been such a feeling of emptiness. This happens because the return to the tree of life is not about accumulating concepts, but about truly assimilating them on one's own journey. Knowledge that does not transform becomes mere noise. Knowledge that permeates the entire being becomes consciousness. Now I want to delve even deeper into this point, because it directly touches on the modern search for meaning. More and more people feel that traditional structures no longer answer the most essential questions. It's not about rejecting spirituality, but about rediscovering it outside of walls, labels, and pre-established narratives. This movement is not empty rebellion. It's an ancient call echoing in a new language. It's the same search that has always existed, only adapted to the current moment in humanity. The return to the celestial origin requires something that is often avoided: the integration of shadow and light. There is no true path that denies parts of the self. Everything that has been rejected, silenced, or judged needs to be seen honestly. Not to be glorified, but to be understood. The tree of life represents unity, and unity is not selective fragmentation. It is conscious inclusion. It is sufficient spiritual maturity to sustain paradoxes without needing to destroy them. This process has a direct impact on how someone lives, thinks, and positions themselves in the world. The mindset begins to change. Decisions are no longer made solely out of fear or external approval. An internal sense of alignment emerges that doesn't depend on constant validation. That's when spirituality ceases to be theory and becomes a silent practice. Not something that is announced, but something that manifests itself. The interesting thing is understanding how this return happens in cycles. It's not a single definitive event, but a series of small recognitions along the journey. Each time someone chooses truth over convenience, something reconnects. Each time someone abandons an identity that no longer serves them, something draws closer to the origin. Eden ceases to be the past and becomes an internal state. There is also a collective aspect to this movement. As more people make this inner return, certain narratives begin to lose strength. Fear as a tool of control weakens. Guilt as a spiritual mechanism dissolves. In its place, conscious responsibility emerges. Not through imposition, but through clarity. Those who remember their own origins don't need to be forced to act coherently. It happens naturally. Perhaps that's why this story keeps reappearing in different eras, cultures, and languages. It doesn't belong to a specific religion. It belongs to the symbolic structure of human experience. The path of return has always been there, disguised as myth, parable, or allegory, waiting for the moment when the collective consciousness would be ready to reinterpret it. And that moment seems ever closer, not because of perfection, but because of the exhaustion of old models. As this understanding deepens, something begins to align more clearly. The return to the celestial origin is not an escape from the world, but a more lucid presence within it. It is not a denial of matter, but a conscious integration of it. The spiritual ceases to be opposed to the human and becomes its most refined expression. This is the point where the tree of life ceases to be a distant symbol and begins to manifest as a living practice. And when this perception begins to stabilize, new questions naturally arise. Questions that don't seek ready-made answers, but direct experiences. Questions that point to even more subtle levels of this narrative, where the return is not only individual, but also a larger, almost invisible movement happening behind the scenes of human history. It is precisely there that this journey begins to reveal even deeper layers, connecting what has been forgotten with what is now awakening. If this passage resonated with you, write a word like return, memory, or origin in the comments, just to record this point in your journey as we continue to move forward in this narrative. There is a silent point in this story that only begins to reveal itself when everything that seemed external loses its power. It is in this more subtle space that the secret truly echoes. Not as information hidden in rare books or inaccessible symbols, but as a perception that awakens when consciousness matures enough to sustain it. What has always been called a secret was never locked away. It was veiled, awaiting a specific kind of gaze. a gaze that does not seek to dominate, prove, or convince, but to understand. When someone approaches this level of perception, something curious happens. The anxiety for answers diminishes and gives way to deeper listening. Revelations cease to be dramatic events and become internal recognitions. It's as if certain ideas had always been there, just waiting for the moment when the mind was ready to integrate them without distortion. This is the true threshold between curiosity and wisdom. Now I want to delve even deeper into this point, because it completely changes how we understand spiritual knowledge. There is a radical difference between knowing something and being ready to live it. Many truths are not dangerous in themselves, but because of the impact they cause when they encounter fragile internal structures. That's why the veil was never a punishment. It was a form of natural protection, a filter that allows each person to access only what they can sustain without fragmenting themselves. This secret that still echoes doesn't present itself in a grand way. It manifests itself in small ruptures of perception, in moments when an old certainty loses its meaning and something broader takes its place. It is in this process that real transformation happens, not as forced change, but as inevitable expansion. Consciousness broadens, and with it, responsibility. There is no possible return to previous naivete, but there is also no unnecessary burden when the process is organic. Many ancient traditions already pointed to this, even if in different languages. The idea that certain knowledge is only revealed to those who undergo a specific inner journey appears repeatedly throughout history. Not out of spiritual elitism, but out of lucidity. Not all truth needs to be spoken aloud. Some need to be recognized in silence. This recognition is intimate, non-transferable, and impossible to rush. The impact of this on daily life is profound, though subtle. Decisions begin to emerge from a more aligned place. Fear loses some of its control. The need for external approval diminishes. Not because the person becomes indifferent to the world, but because they begin to move from a more stable center. This center is not spiritual arrogance, it is inner coherence. It is when the journey ceases to be about accumulating answers and becomes about sustaining more honest questions. There is also a sense of humility that accompanies this stage. The closer one gets to this secret, the more one realizes how much there is still to integrate. There is no feeling of superiority, only of responsibility. The hidden truth does not inflate the ego, it gradually dissolves it. And perhaps this is one of the clearest signs that the process is happening in the right way. The secret answers those who seek it, but it doesn't answer just any search. It manifests when intention ceases to be about control and becomes about alignment. When curiosity transforms into inner commitment. When a person is willing to reconsider decisions, patterns, and beliefs that previously seemed untouchable. This type of journey is not comfortable, but it is profoundly liberating. It demands presence, courage, and a genuine willingness to traverse inner layers without external guarantees. And yet, none of this happens all at once. The echo is gradual. First as intuition, then as insight, then as practical change. Each revealed layer requires integration before the next one approaches. That is why true knowledge never imposes itself. It offers itself, waits, and observes. If there is space, it reveals itself. If there is not, it remains silent, without judgment. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this process is realizing that the secret never wanted to be discovered by force. It always responded to the rhythm of human consciousness. As this consciousness matures collectively, certain symbols gain new interpretations, certain stories are reorganized, certain myths cease to be literal and become internal maps. Nothing changes externally, but everything is reorganized internally. This perception leaves a strange, almost familiar feeling, as if something old were being remembered in a new language. Not as nostalgia, but as recognition. And when this happens, a silent understanding arises that the journey does not end here. It merely changes in depth. What once seemed the end of a quest reveals itself as the gateway to an even more refined listening, where what is being revealed can no longer be separated from the observer. If this resonated with you in any way, write something like, "I'm ready to listen," or "This sparked something in me," in the comments, just to mark that point before we move forward on this journey. If you've made it this far, it's because some part of this conversation truly resonated with you. And that's precisely why this channel exists. Here, the idea isn't to provide ready-made answers, but to open paths, provoke reflection, and accompany those who feel this calling for something deeper, more genuine, more aligned with their own journey. If this type of content helps you see old stories with new eyes and look inward with more clarity, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue walking alongside me. Each video is born from this silent exchange between the creator and the attentive listener. If it makes sense, leave a comment saying this message was for me, or I made it to the end, just so I know you were here until the very end and that this reflection also touched you in some way. The like, in this case, isn't just a click, it's a sign of connection, that this conversation was worth the time and energy of the person on the other side of the screen. And if you feel this journey doesn't end here, there's a video right next to this that connects directly to everything we've talked about today. Click on it and continue the conversation there, on another level, at the same pace.